Alright, so very recently I was able to get my hidden artifact appearance skin on my Disc Priest, even though my item level is way below what should allow you to do it. My equipped item level was only 896. Even though those things are tuned for like Tomb of Sargeras gear. And it totally feels that way because I did not have enough DPS to do it. Until I found a method that allowed me to pretty much increase my DPS by a lot by playing very risky. So let me just go through everything I did real quick. So first off, I do have one DPS legendary and no utility ones. I have an utility one, but I didn't use it for this fight because it wasn't very good. So I have the belt, which every time I use Smite, I have a 30% chance to reduce the cooldown of Penance, well, to completely remove it. It doesn't proc very often, but it is a DPS increase, which was nice. The other legendary I used was my Shadow Priest Hood, just because it had good stats on it. I have other legendaries, but none of them had good stats or good effects for a one-man show. Also, my 4-set bonus was completely useless, so I just dropped it. The 2-set bonus is also kind of useless, but it can be situationally useful. That was nice. So I didn't really need a specific legendary. As for my trinkets, I ran 1 mana trinket and 1 DPS trinket. I wanted to run 2 DPS trinkets if I really could have, because I really needed DPS, but I was running out of mana towards the end of the fight because I didn't have enough DPS. So I was able to compromise with 1 mana trinket, Dark Moon, Deck Promises, and 1 DPS trinkets, as long as I used a mana potion sometime during the fight. Obviously not before the fight, I pre-potted with something else. So that was my gear. Nothing really special about my gear. I had a lot more success with Whispers in the Dark than I did with all the other damaging trinkets. The ones that have like procs and effects, because Disc Priests, their proc effects for trinkets, which actually do damage, are nerfed by like 70%, so they're not that good, but I tried to use them anyway because I thought they would really help on the worms, but I just tried Whispers in the Dark and I got the attempt that one, so I guess that was a pretty good one. It is a nice speed buff, and the negative effect afterwards is not really a big deal. Okay, so that's it for the gear. Obviously, I also had full raid buffs, a flask, the Defiled Augment Rune, and a food buff, and pre-pot and Drums of Fury before the pull, so I have Bloodlust. I found doing it Bloodlust before the pull was probably for the best, because that's when you get all your procs and everything, and there's no real good time in the fight to use it, so just using it right off the start when I pull with my artifact weapon seemed to be the best case scenario. That way I wouldn't forget to use it throughout the fight as well. And Prolonged Power for my pre-pot, because it's cheap, and I did tons and tons of attempts. I'd say about 75, but I don't actually have a real number. But I did have to farm a lot of Nether Shards. How many do I even have left? 1,200. I could have did 12 more attempts. I had 2,500 today after I did all the world quests in Azuna. Okay, so that takes care of my gear. 1 mana trinket, 1 DPS trinket, because I was able just to use a mana potion throughout the fight when I was getting low, and that seemed to work. I still was out of mana at the end of the fight, but I didn't really need it once Feltotem dude was dead. So I did run out of mana anyway, even though I used a mana potion, but I didn't. It ran out when I didn't need it anymore, so it was fine. The worm didn't do very much damage once the other guy died. Okay, so now the other thing that really helped was I had a weak auras that showed me when the Feltotem would spawn and when the interrupt was going out. I'll explain the fight after this, or maybe I'll explain it before and put it into this video. I'm just kind of doing this off the cuff because I want to get it done as fast as possible since I think this event ends today. And I also had a macro for the totem, which really helped. I'll put the macro on screen and also put in the video description, as well as the weak auras that I use, because I didn't make it myself, I used it from someone else. So I'll have the link to that, and I'll have the macro I used for the Feltotem. Because, man, that was a big pain in the ass getting interrupted and having to watch out for the Feltotem. Those are my two biggest problems with it, and the weak auras completely made it not a problem anymore, which was great. Also, the macro helped too. I wasn't using a macro before. I was targeting the totem manually, and I finally just made the macro, and I just pressed it without having to worry about it. That was great. Okay, now, the big thing that allowed me to do this with not as good gear was my Twist of Fate talent. All the other ones, there's a reason for pretty much everything. Castigation, I use this one that would get 1 extra tick of penance since I have the legendary belt that allows me to reset it. That's like my best DPS. I also take Masochism because you really need that extra 10% damage reduction to survive some of those foul blasts. So you can't take any speed. Psychic Voice, you need that in order to have a 30-second Psychic Scream to interrupt his Fel Blast. I was taking Mindbender, but Power Word Solace is also good, except I would rather cast an extra Smite because of my legendary, that way I can possibly get a proc, than use that global cooldown on a Solace. So I went for Mindbender, even though I think Solace gives you more mana. And mana was a big concern, but I was more concerned about damage, and Mindbender also is also a lot of damage. And then Twist of Fate. This is how I was able to cheese the fight. You see, when he uses his Fel Blast, what you're supposed to do is interrupt it or mitigate it in some way because it does like 3 million damage. And I have 3.5 million health, so it's a little bit more than 90%, or maybe like exactly 90%, or maybe it's a little bit less. But it's a lot of health. If you're not at full health, you're probably gonna die. But with Twist of Fate, if I heal a target that's below 35% health, I will do 20% more damage and healing for the next 10 seconds. So what I did was I intentionally took the Fel Blast to my face without mitigating them, and with just using like a Power Word Shield, but I just keep myself at full health and having a Masochism buff up where I was taking 10% less damage, because I could take an additional 10% less damage if I also used Fade. So with just Masochism and a bubble, I was taking the Fel Blast to the face and getting my health below 35% to proc Twist of Fate. And what I was also doing was leaving the dot he puts on you. He also puts a dot on you very frequently throughout the fight, which does 200,000 damage a tick. And you can pretty much ignore it if you just want to go for damage, and that's what I did. But it also does hurt if you're in a spot where you can't really atonement heal through the damage, so it's a good idea to dispel it. But I was leaving it on, that way it would continuously bring me below 35% health. That way I could keep proccing Twist of Fate. Because if I attack, my atonement will heal me, which will proc Twist of Fate. So 20% more damage and healing, and I just kept going below 35 and then going up, below, and going back up because of the dot I had in myself. So I was juggling around very low health in a fight where there's a lot of things that can kill you really quickly. And that's how I was able to circumvent my gear disadvantage, was by playing very risky with keeping my health low, so I could proc Twist of Fate as much as possible to get 20% more damage and healing. And even then, I still barely made it, and I ran out of mana at the end of the fight. And then for the last two, you need Halo in order to kill the worms. I tried a couple attempts without it, because I thought Clarity Will be really good to block his Fel Blast, back before I was juggling with Twist of Fate. And man, did those worms just take longer to kill without a Halo to hit them all at once. It helps so much for them. And then for the last slot, Purge the Wicked, because instead of actually DPSing the worms, I would just take the Feltotem guy and just kite him on top of the worms. That way I could cleave Purge the Wicked with Penance. That way I can get as much uptime on the guy as possible without having to go to the ads, and then I would just let the dot slowly kill them. Or sometimes attack them if things weren't going my way and I wasn't able to cleave. Or if I missed him with Halo or just some other circumstance, or at the very end when he spawns 3 worms, I down those guys as fast as possible. Because if you have 3 worms attacking you, you don't have time to stand still. because they're going to continuously shoot acid at you, and if you can't stand still, you can't DPS, which is bad. So it's more DPS to just kill them at that point, rather than dancing around with just letting them get cleaved really slowly with Purge the Wicked. But that was the best way to get as much uptime on the boss as possible. Alright. And I think that's it for as far as I got the thing down. The biggest thing was definitely Twist of Fate. If I wasn't being plain super risky with letting my health go below 35% all the time, I wouldn't have the damage to kill it, because I just don't have the gear. So I was able to do it by, living on the edge. And even then, I barely got it. Alright. I think that's it for that. Alright, now for the actual fight itself. As soon as it starts off, I pop my pre-pot, Bloodlust, and then I open up with my Light's Wrath, since it has a really long cast time. And then I just attack, and I don't even use a bubble for the first one. I just let him kill me, that way I can get my Twist of Fate debuff up. And then I just completely pound into Blood Totem and cleave the dot onto the worm, so I try to get close to him. Because I want to do a little bit of cleave damage to the worm, but for the most part I'm ignoring him. And then during the phase, when he spawns the worms, I keep on attacking Feltotem, and I'll run to the middle of the room with my penance, because it gives me a small little speed buff, and then just use Halo once the eggs are spawned to attack them. Then, for the most part, I ignore the worms, and I just keep attacking Blood Totem. And then, once they spawn into worms, I start kiting him over the the worms. That way I can cleave my dot onto him with penance while I'm attacking Blood Totem. And while all this is happening, the worm will circle the room in a very annoying pattern. And you see those spikes on the floor? You have to kite him through those spikes, that way he removes his armor, because he has like a little debuff on him, which is at 9 stacks, where it reduces the damage by 10% for each one. And I think you can only remove like 3 of them per phase with the worms, so you just have to kite him over those things in order to remove all 9 stacks. So at the end of the fight you can kill him. Luckily for the Disc Priest version of this fight, he doesn't rage, but he doesn't really do that much more damage than he did before. The only thing you have to really worry about is the interrupt, which is not a bad thing at all to worry about, because none of the other phases go on at the very last. So for the most part, until the end of the fight, you just ignore the worm, and while you're trying to cleave the dot onto the little worms, they always spawn near the spikes anyway, so the worm is going to try to attack you around the room, and he's just going to remove his armor by himself, just from you pretty much ignoring him. So you don't really have to worry about him, other than try not to get stunned by him, because you will die if you get stunned. Now, there's also another thing he spawns, his Feltotem. He only spawns the Feltotem after the first ground phase. And then afterwards he'll spawn it, I don't know, every 30 seconds or so. So you don't really have to worry about it until the first ground phase. And with the Weak Auras add-on, and the string into it that allows me to actually track the Feltotem, and the macro, the Feltotem is not a problem at all. Whereas before I had the Weak Auras thing and the macro, it was a huge problem, because if the Feltotem doesn't die, it will stun you for 5 seconds. Luckily it dies to basically anything. Sometimes I'll kill it with Halo while I'm trying to, hit the worms with it, because it spawns around that time too. But for the most part, as long as you have the add-on, just hit it with the macro and it's not an issue at all. Also, when the worm, he's about to do his interrupt, which he does after the ground phase is over, and he does 2 more times during the up phase, where he's just sitting up there shooting you with poison. He takes 4 seconds or so to cast it, so I usually just get off 1 cast, and then I'll just do my instant casts, refresh my dot or put up a power word shield. And then that's all I gotta really worry about, or if I have another instant cast thing. And then there's the big problem of the fight, is his Fel Blast ability. When he uses that on you, it does 3 million damage, so you have to either interrupt it or mitigate it, or be at full health and just eat it. That way you can proc Twist of Fate. I procced Twist of Fate as much as humanly possible. I even let the dot stay on me that he'll just randomly do on you. You can either just ignore it or dispel it. But if you dispel it, you're using a global cooldown that could have been used for damage. So sometimes it's okay to ignore it, but like during the ground phase is a good time to just dispel it, because you never know if you're going to get stunned or get hit by a whole bunch of other damage from something else. But during the up phase, I rarely dispel it unless I know I'm not going to be at full health quick enough to be able to just tank his Fel Blast to the face. At which point, I'll actually dispel it. For the most part, I want the debuff to be on me during the up phase, because I want to be able to stay below 35% health as long as possible to keep proccing Twist of Fate. Because with Atonement, every time you attack, you're healing yourself. So you're just continuously proccing the buff over and over. So in the ideal world, you want to stay below 35% health the entire fight, but you can't do that because you need to be at 100% health in order to tank his Fel Blast ability. And there's other abilities that hit you too, which do a lot of damage. Like when the worm does his interrupt, it does 1,000,000 damage, which is about, I don't know, like 25% of your health. Or 20%. It's usually like around 15% though, because I always have some kind of mitigation up. And then towards the end of the fight, once you have the Feltotem taken care of, the ground phase with the worms taken care of, because you have to kill the worms, otherwise you won't be able to stand still to DPS. And once you've figured out a good way to interrupt his Fel Blast, either tank it to the face or during the ground phase, I interrupt all of them as much as I can. Unless I can get away with taking one to the face, that way I can proc Twist of Fate more. But for the most part, I save my Psychic Scream for the ground phase, because Psychic Scream does interrupt the Fel Blast, which I didn't actually know at first, because usually if you Psychic Scream a mob and they're casting at you, it doesn't interrupt, it just saves it for later. They're going to use it, the spell, as soon as they're done with the fear. But in this fight, any kind of CC will interrupt it, which is great. Also, since I'm a Blood Elf, I also have an emergency one where I can use my Arcane Torrent. But I don't think I actually had to use it as an emergency in the attempt I got the kill. I just kind of used it as one because I felt like it, and because I needed the mana from the cooldown, which gives you 2% more mana every time you use it. So I just wanted to keep it off cooldown, because I knew mana would be a problem. And then towards the end of the fight, Feltotem, his Fel Blast will actually start hitting harder, and he'll start using it a little bit more often. So if throughout the fight you were actually using your mitigation like Fade or Psychic Scream, because those are the two ways to block it like reliably, Psychic Scream completely stops it, and Fade is a 10% extra damage reduction, which allows you to live through it a lot better, as long as you have Magicism. The healing buff from Shadow Mend and Fade, you're able to tank it pretty easily. But towards the end of the fight, where he starts doing it more often and it starts doing more damage, Fade isn't enough to stop it, so you have to use a major cooldown. So you really want to save Power Word Barrier and Pain Suppression for the end of the fight, where you literally can't use, where I can't just tank it to the face anymore because it does too much damage. I have to use a big cooldown or interrupt it with stuff like my Arcane Torrent or Psychic Scream. But since Psychic Scream will probably be on cooldown since it's doing it more often, that's where Barrier and Pain Suppression comes in, because you still probably have to use Fade as well, because Barrier is not going to save you on its own because it just does too much damage. And the worm will start, I don't think the worm actually does his little interrupt more often towards the end of the fight. But towards the end of the fight, where the Fel Blast starts hitting harder, it does line up with the Fel Blast, so you're not able to really cast when he's about to do it, so it kind of sucks. So you need a cooldown, you need to already be at full health, and you need to have the dot purge, because you can't really have it on anymore, because you're taking so much damage towards the end of the fight, you just can't really deal with it. But once you have all that done, and you have the DPS, because that's kind of like the soft enrage, where he starts doing the Fel Blasts more frequently, and they start hitting harder. And also, towards the end of the fight, he'll start spawning 3 worms instead of 2, so you have to have more stuff to DPS. So at this point, you're either going to run out of mana, or cooldowns, because the Fel Blast is going to kill you. And this is why you need good gear. And this is why I was being super risky with Twist of Fate. That way I could DPS him down before all this happens. I wasn't able to DPS him down before it all happens, but I was able to DPS him down before I no longer had cooldowns to tank the extra damage. Because I was able to kill him while I didn't have none of my major cooldowns up anymore. I did have a Psychic Scream, so I was safe for the next one. But I would have died on the one after that. And thanks to the risky play, I had the DPS to down him before that. So I had about 30 seconds of leeway. But then again, I was out of mana towards the end of the fight. And I got a little bit risky once I was just fighting the worm by himself, because he was actually starting to hit pretty hard, because he enrages when Feltotem dies. But as long as you use like a Fade or something, it's not really a big deal. I think you might actually be able to interrupt him too. I didn't actually try though, because I just healed through it because I didn't think it was a big deal. But they did start hurting towards the end. I think I almost got one shot, like on the one right before I killed him, which would have sucked, but I mean, I didn't, and I got him dead. And man, did I feel great getting, just because I spent like so long in this fight, and I knew I was under geared, but I kept doing it anyway, and I'm just so glad I was able to cheese it with Twist of Fate. I'm glad I tried that. I don't even know how I got the idea in my head to just try to stay below 20% health as long as I could. But it worked, and I had the DPS for it, even though I barely got it.